Hello, this is Ned Dodington, the founder and director of the Expanded Environment. I want to thank you first off for inviting me to participate in Untaming the Urban. Looks like a really exciting symposium and gathering of researchers and innovators, and I apologize for being unable to attend in person. Hopefully we'll be able to get a sense of some of the work that's going on with the Expanded Environment through this presentation. Urban Umwelt, already wild, and hopefully also it will spark some conversation, which I understand will be potentially leading to publications later. So all really exciting, and I look forward to hearing and reading more of the work that comes out of the symposium. So firstly, the layout of this presentation, basically a brief introduction to the Expanded Environment for those who may not have visited or are already aware of the work on the website. And then a quick introduction to the kind of current working thesis on the website, followed by some brief examples of projects from around the world that we think may embody and exhibit some of these untamed and wild ideas. So briefly, the Expanded Environment is a nonprofit organization devoted to educating and showing designers and architects how to engage with biological factors and processes already, for the most part, active in urban contexts. So it's a web-based organization. This is an image of our front page as of a few weeks ago. It's theexpandederenvironment.org. And here's our mission statement, as I've already mentioned. We try to collect projects from around the world as a means of demonstrating ways and exhibiting kind of what we think of outside-the-box thinking or progressive ideas that designers, governments, municipalities, designers, architects can use to train or let's say reshape the built environment to be more open in many ways to the ecological and biological forces around them. Kind of larger picture, it's a post-humanist project. This is an idea. It's trying to position the built world as the main mechanism that we can use to cross species lines. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute, but we really think that architecture in the built world is a lever, as a fulcrum, as a bridge that can sort of translate between human and non-human worlds, and try to get beyond a kind of humanist conception of architecture and the built environment. But as I said, the main function of the Expanded Environment Online is to basically set up competitions. These are 3 of our most recent competitions, and where we solicit work from around the world. We organize a jury and basically collect and then catalog the kind of projects that come in, and this kind of serves as a way to, we think, kind of organize research that's kind of happening around the world in this topic of expanded architecture, and it's also a way to kind of drum up awareness and to celebrate really progressive design. So on the website are currently somewhere around 200 projects that get into various different aspects of what happens to architecture as a profession when you start to engage non-human actors. My personal feeling is that this is a transformative process, being that once you start to define architecture outside of humanism, it really effectively it redefines the practice. Architecture becomes an entirely new and hitherto unseen practice when it's involved with non-human agents. That's probably a topic for a little bit of a later discussion, but it's something that I think probably resonates pretty deeply with this symposium. So the main topic that I'd like to bring up with the audience today, and hopefully something that really catches your ear, is that when we talk about untaming the urban, I think we have to be sort of already aware that urban environments are already hosts, maybe unwittingly, to a quite wide range non-human agents. And so this is generally considered synanthropic species, and synanthropy being sort of, with anthropos, right? So these are animals that exist alongside and within human areas, and they tend to be very generalist species, but they do indeed exist. And what we're seeing today, which is alarming, is that that's kind of the number of generalist species seems to be declining in many sort of westernized and urbanized areas. Biodiversity, and this probably doesn't need to be said in this context, but biodiversity within urban areas is declining, and what is sort of unknown is the effects of this. How detrimental would be a sort of almost total lack of biodiversity be in urban areas. So that's part of the background information here, as how do we kind of preserve biodiversity in urban areas, or how do we incentivize it? What are the benefits there? And also, what are the risks? But I think first off, we have to recognize that there is biodiversity in many urban areas. This is Pale Male sitting on his perch above Central Park with the Metropolitan Museum. In the background, one of the more famous non-human residents in an urban area. And I guess this slide sort of illustrates that point earlier, that we really live in a world where this kind of biodiversity is neglected or not recognized, and almost completely outside of the scope of architects, for example, and usually not on the radar of urban planners. And this caption here is that it's a monospecies world. We tend to consider our environments as really only for us, and us being humans. We don't consider the fact that there may be red-tailed hawks that want to roost on our ledges, or a nice population of other mammals sometimes that get into our attics and in between our walls, but that they're around, and that this is what we want to kind of investigate at the expanded environment, is a way to engage a more sort of polyspecies or panspecies approach to design. And as I mentioned, this is we think that built form can actually be the sort of fulcrum, can be the habitat, can be the bridge between human and non-human worlds. And there's a really interesting passage by Jacob von Uexküll, a sort of an early 20th century author who was writing about Umwelt, and Umwelt being inner worlds, and each animal exists in its own sort of inner world that's built of sort of its sense organs. So the Umwelt of a tick is very different from the Umwelt of a human, which is very different from the Umwelt of an oyster, for example. And so they're kind of these inner worlds of subjectivity that are sort of occupying the environment in different ways. And I think a really good example of this is that, a tree, and this is a sort of a beautiful old live oak tree, is so very open to multiple umwelts in a way that our built worlds, if you go back to that slide of the previous development in China, is not. So this is the thing, the sort of the thickness of environment that I think we have in mind when we're talking about an expanded environment and about a way of investigating bridges across umwelts, as it were, is that the oak tree can mean something and be productive across different species. So, for example, the oak tree can be a home to squirrels, birds, ants, fungus, bacteria, lichen, as we see, and vines in this image, in a way that our homes and our buildings are not. And at best we have sort of quotes pest species that kind of occupy sort of corners and lacunas in the buildings. At worst, we really actively reject them, and this ends up being a very thin environment, the way I sort of speak about it. Another great example from Uexküll here is how the spider web is a three-dimensional manifestation of fly space that is mapped by spiders. I'll say that again, that the spider web, is an object which maps fly space according to the view of spiders. So his thinking is that the spider spins this web in a way that completely mirrors, or let's say enmeshes with, the fly's world. It's designed to catch flies, and if, say, the spider were attempting to catch elephants, the web would look very differently. So we're kind of taking this idea at the expanded environment that objects, in this case best sort of exemplified by a spider web, as an object that can transcend worlds. Since it's an object that's built by spiders but maps fly space, we have a multi-Umwelt object in this situation. Somewhat like the multi-Umwelt object of the tree, but this is, in the spider web's case, is a non-living object. And we think this is a really interesting model. Of course, spider webs are used as allegories and sort of metaphors for architecture in the past, but we don't think ever in this way, never as a sort of trans-umwelting object. And so we think this is a really, really cool idea. And there may be other examples of a trans-umwelting object, like this is a reused subway car that's now being repurposed by fish. So the fish are kind of repurposing or reoccupying a human space. There are sort of bird recolonizations of other structures. Obviously, one of maybe the most close to home examples is a bat bridge. So it's both in the human world and the bat world. Almost, you can't think of a better habitat for bats. And this is the one in Austin. You may know that I'm based in Houston. Actually, Houston has its own bat bridge, not quite as famous as that in Austin. So that's the that's the kind of the gist of the work on the expanded environment at this point. We're trying to define a way of speaking about architecture as a trans-umwelting object, and trying to find projects that best sort of question architecture's anthropomorphic past and new ways of engaging in sort of design practice from a sort of a post-human perspective. I have about 2 minutes left to go on this talk, so I just breeze through maybe 5 projects from the website that might engage your attention here. Generally on the website we tend to see 3 different types of projects: synanthropic habitats, softscapes, and post-animal projects. And I'll just kind of go into these really fast. So synanthropic habitats are those that try to engage animals in our own space. It's about bringing animals together. Joyce Huang, who is a kind of co-presenter with me in this series, is she can speak much more closely about her work, but she is an often contributor to the expanded environment. This was a butterfly and butterfly habitat and sewing manufacturers, kind of needlework stitching location in South America. One of the more recent projects that we just love to talk about on the expanded environment is the work by Sarah Gunawan, a recent MArch candidate at U Toronto. She's developed these appendages that attach to suburban homes to attract or entice or provide shelter for non-human residents: owls, chimney swifts, raccoons. And then she considers the whole thing as a sort of a dynamic system across the suburban landscape, and how does that reorient suburban habitation when you start to map and invite non-human residents. Softscapes are large, ecologically minded projects. They tend to be more sort of landscape urbanist in their feeling. This was sort of one of our favorites. It's an oceanic agriculture project, sort of hypothesizing that you could repurpose, decommissioned aircraft carriers and liners, ocean liners. This was a zoo that was sort of embedded across a ravine in South Korea. Obviously, landscape bridges. This one, the Ark Wildlife Crossing in Banff, is a sort of typical kind of example of a sort of softscape project. So these are humans designing specifically for animal use at a large scale. Finally, and maybe the most exciting for me, are the sort of post-animal projects. These are a couple illustrations from Brandon Ute, who really tries to engage in illustrating the world of the animal through its own eyes, and he's using a combination of collage and sketching and pen work here to kind of get at different sort of future worlds where animals may have a more active role or engagement in the built environment. I see that I'm out of time, but really I hope to spark your interest. Think about the built world as a trans umwelting object, and really push that as far as you can, and I think we'll completely redefine architecture and arrive at a new world. Thanks so much for your time. Visit the expanded environment. Take care. Bye.